A routine flight turned into a nightmare in just 5 minutes. A black veteran calmly asks for help, but moments later he's being dragged off the plane by police. What led to this shocking escalation, and why did it happen so quickly? Stay tuned to find out what really went down on Flight 190. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today, and if you find this story interesting, don't forget to subscribe for more. It all began as an ordinary journey. Calvin Drake, a 37-year-old U.S. Army veteran, had just wrapped up an emotional military reunion and was looking forward to a peaceful trip home after a long, fulfilling weekend. As he stepped onto Flight 180, he carried with him memories of camaraderie and a quiet anticipation of rest. Little did he know that within moments, the calm of his journey would dissolve into chaos, leaving everyone on board in shock. As the cabin slowly filled with passengers, an unexpected ripple of tension started to build. The routine interaction between crew and traveler took a sudden turn when the flight attendant, Chloe Morgan, approached him. She asked if he could store his bag in the overhead compartment, as she noticed it was blocking the aisle. Calvin, who had already placed his bag in the compartment above him, politely explained that it wasn't blocking the aisle and that it was in an acceptable position. He was just asking for a little more time to settle in and adjust his things. Chloe, however, seemed irritated by his response. With a curt, unyielding tone, she pressed him once more, making it unmistakably clear that she wasn't open to any further explanation. Trying to ease the tension, Calvin maintained his calm and gently asked, "Is there a problem?" "I'm just trying to get comfortable for the flight." After his question, Chloe's eyes flashed briefly with an air of impatience, before she turned and walked away without another word. Convinced that the misunderstanding had been resolved, Calvin settled back into his seat, hoping the matter was behind him. Yet, the fragile calm was shattered when, just moments later, Chloe returned. This time her demeanor was even sterner as she abruptly ordered him to stop holding up the flight and insisted he comply immediately. Confused and frustrated, Calvin calmly reiterated that he wasn't doing anything wrong and that the situation wasn't as serious as she made it out to be. The cabin buzzed with a quiet intensity as fellow passengers exchanged uneasy glances, each silently bracing for what might come next. Instead of simply acknowledging Calvin's concerns, Chloe seemed more focused on making him feel small. The exchange continued to escalate, and then, unexpectedly, Chloe reached for her radio and signaled for security to come to the gate. Calvin, still confused, couldn't believe what was happening. In an unforeseen twist, his quiet desire for a little personal space had swiftly morphed into a call for security intervention. "I didn't do anything wrong," he thought to himself, yet the situation had already spiraled beyond his control. In a matter of seconds, the simmering tension that had been building in the cabin exploded into chaos. Chloe's voice suddenly rang out, laden with a cold authority. "This man is causing a disturbance. He needs to be removed from the plane just like that." What began as a simple disagreement between a flight attendant and a passenger was rapidly evolving into something far more ominous, casting a dark cloud over the entire flight. Calvin, who had been quietly sitting and trying to process the unfolding events, now felt the crushing weight of every pair of eyes upon him. The familiar hum of the airplane faded into an eerie silence as murmurs and anxious whispers filled the cabin. Each passenger, caught in their own uncertainty, bore silent witness to the mounting drama, leaving Calvin to wonder how a minor misunderstanding could escalate so drastically. A few minutes later, 2 officers appeared at the gate. They weren't the kind of police officers one would expect to see on a plane. There were no calming words or attempts to mediate. The officers stood at the front, eyeing Calvin Drake without saying a word. One of them, a tall officer with a firm jaw, stepped forward and spoke to Calvin Drake. "Sir, we need you to leave the plane," he said, his tone sharp and unwavering. Already frustrated, Calvin Drake stood up slowly, trying to figure out what was going on. He had spent years in the military, mastering the art of composure under fire, Yet nothing in his training had prepared him for this bewildering confrontation aboard a commercial flight. The sterile hum of the cabin was now pierced by the tension of an inexplicable dispute. In a measured tone born of both confusion and resolve, he addressed the officer. "Why am I being asked to leave?" "I haven't done anything wrong," the officer simply repeated the order, his voice becoming colder with each word. "You are being disruptive and we need to remove you from the flight." A simmering anger began to well within him. How had the situation escalated so rapidly? Despite not having raised his voice or created any scene, Calvin found himself unjustly singled out, as if he were a criminal rather than a veteran. In an effort to steady his tumultuous emotions, he inhaled deeply, maintaining his calm as he responded, "I'm just asking for clarification, but I'm happy to cooperate. I just need to get my bag first." The officer's response was immediate and firm. "No, you will leave the plane now." His words brooked no further debate. As Calvin remained standing, the cabin was engulfed in an eerie silence. Some passengers averted their gaze, their discomfort palpable, while others watched with a mixture of confusion and disbelief, wondering how a simple disagreement could spiral into such a serious ordeal. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and every eye seemed fixed on him, as if waiting for the next unfolding moment. The officers made it abundantly clear that there would be no negotiation. They advanced steadily toward Calvin, issuing orders for him to exit the aircraft without delay. What had started as a routine flight now felt like a high-stakes standoff, the situation intensifying with every attempt by Calvin to explain himself. The situation was no longer a mere misunderstanding. It had now transformed into something far more serious, as Calvin Drake was escorted to the plane's exit. A sense of unease settled over the entire cabin. The officers' hands were on their weapons, their body language rigid, signaling that this was not going to be a polite exchange. There was an almost deafening silence, broken only by the sound of the officers' boots on the floor as they moved toward Calvin Drake. Passengers who had been quietly observing the unfolding drama began to shift in their seats. Some exchanged uneasy glances, others whispered to one another in disbelief, but most, however, were glued to the scene, unsure of what was going to happen next. Was this really necessary? Was Calvin Drake truly the threat they were making him out to be? Now standing by the plane's emergency exit, he turned to the officers and calmly asked again, "What exactly am I being arrested for? Can someone please explain this?" His voice, although firm, was still laced with confusion, and at this point he was already gathering his belongings, trying to comply with what was being asked of him, but the officers didn't offer any explanation. One of them simply grabbed his arm, tightening his grip. The other officer moved in behind him, ensuring that there would be no escape. There was no opportunity for Calvin Drake to understand, no chance to ask further questions. His compliance didn't seem to matter anymore. His every movement, every word, was being met with resistance. For a moment, Calvin Drake paused, realizing the gravity of the situation. He wasn't being treated like an innocent passenger who had made a minor request. He was being treated as if he were a criminal. His heart began to race as the officer's grip tightened. The plane, once a place of routine travel, felt like a cage. Passengers looked on, some with sympathetic expressions, others with discomfort. They saw a man, a veteran who had fought for this country, being dragged from his seat and escorted off the plane without an ounce of compassion. There was no apology, no attempt to calm the situation down. The flight attendants, who had witnessed the entire exchange, now stood back, watching in silence, seemingly uninterested in what had transpired. Calvin Drake, still trying to process the reality of it all, felt a surge of frustration. "I'm not a criminal," he muttered under his breath as the officers continued to guide him toward the door. But it was clear this wasn't about reason or logic anymore. It was about control, and Calvin Drake was caught in the middle of it. As the officers' hands grew firmer, Calvin Drake realized that the situation had reached a point of no return. He had never imagined that his attempt to clarify a simple misunderstanding would lead to him being escorted off the flight in such a humiliating way. In those final moments before he was forcibly removed from the plane, everything became surreal. What should have been a simple conversation about a misunderstanding was now a full-blown public spectacle. Before Calvin Drake could fully comprehend what was happening, the officers had already started to move him toward the aisle. His feet were barely touching the ground as they tugged at his arms, forcing him to walk in a way that felt almost unnatural. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Passengers sat frozen in their seats, eyes wide, some gasping in disbelief at what they were witnessing. Calvin Drake tried to keep his balance, but the officers weren't gentle. One officer gripped his arm so tightly that it felt like his bones were going to crack, while the other, walking behind him, kept a close watch as if he might attempt to break free. Though physically and mentally exhausted, Calvin Drake tried to remain calm. "I'm not resisting," he muttered, hoping his words might de-escalate the situation. "I'm just trying to understand why this is happening." But the officers didn't stop. They didn't listen to his pleas or even acknowledge his attempt to explain himself. Instead, they shoved him forward, pulling him along with little regard for his dignity or his well-being. As they reached the front of the plane, the chaos that was once just a low hum among passengers turned into something louder. People began whispering more urgently, some shaking their heads, others taking out their phones to capture the scene. It was almost as if the entire plane was holding its breath, watching as a man who had served his country with honor was being treated like a criminal. Passengers exchanged glances, some with pity, others with confusion, but no one stood up to stop what was happening. Some passengers, still stunned, kept their eyes trained on the scene in front of them, while others looked away, perhaps unable to stomach the sight. Now, standing in front of the plane's exit, Calvin Drake realized how surreal it all felt. He had never imagined a day when a simple disagreement with a flight attendant would result in him being dragged off the plane like this. The reality of it hit him hard. No explanation, no understanding, just an overwhelming sense of injustice. "Please, I just need to get my things," Calvin Drake said, his voice shaky, but the officer holding his arm didn't respond. Instead, the officers pushed forward, guiding him toward the door, as if his belongings didn't matter anymore. It was clear that their goal was simply to remove him from the plane, and everything else, his comfort, his rights, seemed secondary. One last look around the cabin revealed the stunned faces of the passengers. Some had their phones out, recording what was happening, while others remained eerily silent. The entire plane seemed to be a captive audience to an event none of them could have predicted when they first boarded the flight. As Calvin Drake was led through the narrow aisle, he felt the eyes of everyone on him. It was humiliating, it was degrading, and it was wrong. His body was being dragged off the plane, but in those final moments, his mind was racing, trying to make sense of how this had spiraled out of control. One minute he was quietly seated, and the next he was a public spectacle. With a final tug at his arm, Calvin Drake was thrust into the jet bridge, the doors to the plane slamming shut behind him. The harsh reality of the situation hit him all at once. He was now outside the plane, standing in the cold, feeling both physically and emotionally drained. He had been taken off the flight, but the real question was why? The jet bridge door closed with a resounding thud, but the chaos inside the plane hadn't quite settled. Passengers were left in a stunned silence, processing what they had just witnessed. It didn't matter that the plane was still parked at the gate. What had just happened was not something any of them would soon forget. The flight attendants, who had been silent witnesses to the entire ordeal, began to go back to their routine. But the passengers weren't as easily able to move on. Some began speaking to one another in hushed tones, their faces full of disbelief. One woman sitting by the window, shook her head in confusion, muttering to her seatmate, "How could that have escalated so quickly?" Another passenger who had been sitting near Calvin Drake whispered, "He didn't even do anything. I was right there the whole time." But it wasn't just the passengers who were shaken. The incident quickly made its way to social media, where the video footage of Calvin Drake being dragged down the aisle was shared widely. What started as a quiet disagreement between a passenger and a flight attendant had now turned into a full-blown public spectacle. The video, recorded by an observant passenger, quickly gained traction. By the time the plane had even left the gate, the hashtag Justice for Calvin Drake began trending on Twitter. Online reactions were swift and fierce. People from all over the country, veterans, everyday citizens, and social media influencers alike, voiced their anger and disbelief at what had happened. Comments flooded in. "This is why we need better training for flight attendants," one person wrote. "No one should be treated like this, especially not a veteran," another commented. As the story spread, so did the questions. Why did the flight attendant escalate the situation in the first place? Why did the police come in so quickly without attempting to understand what had really happened? And perhaps most importantly, why was Calvin Drake, a decorated military veteran, treated like a criminal? The outrage didn't stop online. Local news stations picked up the story, running segments with the video footage. Interviews with passengers were broadcast, and legal experts weighed in, questioning the actions of both the airline staff and the police. People who had been on the flight, especially those seated near Calvin Drake, were now starting to speak out more publicly. One of them, a man named Jameis, had been seated a few rows behind Calvin Drake and had witnessed everything firsthand, he told a reporter. "It was like they didn't even care to listen. I saw Calvin trying to stay calm. He didn't yell. He didn't even raise his voice. He just wanted an explanation. But instead of talking to him, they called the police, like he was some kind of criminal." The airline issued a brief statement, but it was clear it wasn't enough. "We are aware of the situation and are looking into it," the statement read. But for many, that was nowhere near sufficient. The public wanted answers. Real answers, not just corporate jargon. Calvin Drake's story was quickly becoming more than just an isolated incident. It was a symbol of something larger. It highlighted the way veterans, especially black veterans, were often treated unfairly or dismissed. It brought to light how quickly situations could escalate when communication and understanding were replaced by harsh authority, and it sparked a broader conversation about how everyday people in positions of power could be given so much control over others' lives, especially when they failed to show basic respect or understanding. As the evening news played the footage of Calvin Drake being dragged off the plane repeatedly, the hashtag Justice for Calvin Drake continued to trend. It was clear that the public response wasn't just about this one event. It was about something much deeper. People were tired of seeing injustices, especially against veterans, being swept under the rug. And as the conversation continued to unfold, one thing became clear. The story was far from over. As the video footage continued to circulate online, pressure mounted on the airline and the authorities to take action. The public's anger was palpable, with calls for accountability growing louder every hour. What had started as a seemingly routine flight had now become a flashpoint for a larger debate about power, authority, and the treatment of veterans, particularly black veterans. The phone lines of both the airline and the local police department were flooded with complaints, and social media was awash with people demanding answers. The airline's PR team scrambled to handle the situation, but it quickly became apparent that their initial response wasn't going to be enough. The vague statement they released to the public, "We are aware of the situation and are investigating it," was met with frustration and disbelief. The airline needed to do more than just issue a statement. It needed to show real accountability. Meanwhile, local law enforcement launched an internal investigation into the actions of the officers involved. The police chief, under pressure from both the public and the media, promised a thorough review of the incident. We will ensure that this situation is handled fairly, and if any protocols were violated, the appropriate actions will be taken, the chief said in a press conference. But for many, the words rang hollow. The public wasn't asking for another vague promise. They wanted to see real consequences, real justice. In the days following the incident, various news outlets began interviewing people who had been on the flight. One of the most vocal was Jameis, the passenger who had been sitting behind Calvin Drake and had seen the entire exchange firsthand. What happened to Calvin wasn't just wrong, it was downright unjust. Jameis told a local news station. He was calm the whole time. It was clear that the flight attendant overreacted, and then, instead of trying to de-escalate, they just called the police. He didn't deserve that. His testimony added weight to the growing sense that something had gone terribly wrong during the flight. The investigation didn't just focus on the police officer's actions. The airline also began to review its flight attendant's handling of the situation. Chloe Morgan, the flight attendant who had made the call to security, was placed on administrative leave while the investigation took place. The airline expressed regret over the situation, but stopped short of commenting on her specific actions, leaving many to question whether they would take real action or simply sweep the matter under the rug. Calvin Drake, for his part, had been trying to keep a low profile since the incident. He hadn't made any public statements, and he largely stayed off social media, though the stories and opinions surrounding him continued to swirl. As the investigation unfolded, it was clear that his silence wasn't going to keep him out of the spotlight for long. Supporters of Calvin Drake, including several veteran organizations, were organizing marches and rallies, demanding justice for the veteran. The hashtag Justice for Calvin Drake continued to trend, and soon enough petitions started circulating calling for an official apology from the airline and for a review of police protocols regarding airline incidents. The anger from the public wasn't just about one man's removal from a flight. It was about how quickly a small disagreement had been turned into an unnecessary and humiliating public spectacle. The media kept the story alive, reporting on each new development. But amidst all the chaos, one thing became clear. The public wasn't going to let this go easily. There would be more questions, more demands for accountability, and with every passing day, the pressure on both the airline and the police grew more intense. The investigation was just beginning, but the outrage from the public had already set the stage for what could be a lengthy battle for justice. As the investigation continued and the media spotlight remained focused on the incident, Calvin Drake found himself at the center of a storm he had never anticipated. The Attendant was overwhelming, and though he had served in the military, where his bravery and strength had been tested on the battlefield, nothing could prepare him for the emotional toll of being publicly humiliated in this way. At first, Calvin Drake tried to block out the noise. He avoided reading the news stories, ignored the comments on social media, and kept to himself. But it wasn't easy. His phone rang constantly with calls from reporters, old friends, and even some people he didn't know, all eager to get his side of the story. His family, too, was affected. His mother, who had raised him to stand tall in the face of adversity, was distraught. "Why didn't they listen to you, Calvin?" she asked, her voice trembling on the other end of the phone. "This isn't who you are." Every time he spoke with her, with his brother, or even with his closest friends, the words felt hollow. They tried to comfort him, to remind him of his past accomplishments, his service, his character. But the images of what had happened on that plane, the footage of his removal, replayed over and over in his mind. He couldn't escape the feeling of being trapped, of being dragged through the narrow aisle like a criminal. It wasn't just the physical embarrassment that stung. It was the emotional weight of knowing that so many people, especially veterans like himself, might feel the same way when faced with situations where authority simply overpowers reason. As days passed, Calvin Drake's frustration began to build. It wasn't just about what happened on that flight anymore. It was about how little control he seemed to have over the narrative, the anger, the hurt, the confusion. It all piled up inside him. What had started as a small request, a simple conversation about his bag, had spiraled into something he never imagined would happen. How had they treated him this way? How had things gone from a polite exchange to him being dragged off the plane like a criminal? Every time Calvin Drake saw the headlines or heard another person talk about the incident, he couldn't help but feel a sense of injustice rising within him. This wasn't just about what had happened in that moment, it was about the bigger picture. It was about how often Black veterans were treated unfairly, how quickly their voices were silenced, and how often their concerns were dismissed. The incident wasn't just an isolated moment. It was part of a larger problem that too many people ignored or didn't understand. Calvin Drake started to feel a new sense of responsibility, too. He realized that if this situation was going to have any chance of changing, his voice had to be heard. He had to speak out, not just for himself, but for others who had experienced similar injustices. Every day that passed without speaking up felt like a missed opportunity to make things right. But the decision wasn't easy. He had been taught to remain calm, to avoid confrontation, and to trust that things would eventually work themselves out. However, this time the system hadn't worked in his favor. His experience was a reminder that standing up for yourself didn't always lead to immediate resolution or fairness. And sometimes it took even more courage to demand justice when the odds seemed stacked against you. As the pressure continued to mount, Calvin Drake knew that whatever he decided to do next, whether to stay quiet or speak out, would have a lasting impact. In a way, he was no longer just fighting for himself. His ordeal had become a symbol of something much larger. It was about standing up to an unfair system, about making sure no one else would face what he had gone through without someone willing to speak up. The emotional toll was real, but the weight of silence was beginning to feel heavier. And for the first time since the incident, Calvin Drake was starting to consider that speaking out could be the only way to take back control of his own story. It was nearly a week after the incident when Calvin Drake decided he couldn't stay silent anymore. The media continued to cover the story, and every new headline seemed to twist the knife a little deeper. The police department had yet to announce any concrete actions regarding the officers involved, and the airline's response was still vague. Although the hashtag Justice for Calvin Drake had gained a strong following, Calvin Drake found himself increasingly frustrated. The longer the situation lingered without resolution, the more it felt like a reminder of how powerless he was in that moment. He had always prided himself on being someone who could solve problems and face challenges head-on, but this situation wasn't something he could solve by simply standing firm. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that speaking out wasn't just something he could do, it was something he had to do. Even after another long conversation with his mother, who, despite her concern, urged him to take control of the narrative, Calvin Drake sat down on his couch, his phone resting on the coffee table in front of him. The video of his removal was still all over social media. The images of him being dragged down the aisle, the disbelief on his face, the fear in his eyes. He had seen it 100 times, but every time he watched it, it felt like he was reliving the moment all over again. It wasn't just a video anymore. It had become a symbol of injustice, of humiliation, of something deeper that went beyond the confines of that one flight. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that he wasn't just a passive observer anymore. He wasn't just a victim of an unfair situation. This moment had become bigger than him. The next morning, Calvin Drake called his lawyer. He had already been in touch with him briefly after the incident, but now he was ready to take the next step. "I'm ready to make a statement," Calvin Drake said, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of determination that hadn't been there before. "It's time to take control of this. I can't let this keep happening, not just to me but to others too." His lawyer supported him. offering advice on how to approach the situation in a way that would garner respect without escalating things further. You've got to own your story, Calvin. Don't let anyone else define it for you. If you want justice, you have to fight for it, his lawyer said. It was in that moment that Calvin Drake knew his journey was about to change. He couldn't let the story of that flight be reduced to just a viral video or a public spectacle. It was more than that. It was a story of how easy it was for something small to snowball into a major crisis, how quickly people could be dehumanized, and how power could be misused. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever felt overlooked, misunderstood, or mistreated. A few days later, Calvin Drake released a statement to the public. He posted a video on his social media accounts, his face calm, but his words full of raw emotion. "I want to start by saying that I never imagined this would happen to me," he began. "I've traveled across this country, even across the world, and I've always been treated with respect. I've served my country, but what happened to me on that plane wasn't just wrong, it was a violation of my dignity as a person." He took a deep breath, his voice growing more passionate. "I've been hearing a lot of people say this is about one flight, one disagreement, but it's not. It's about how easily things can escalate. It's about how too many people, especially veterans, especially Black veterans, are treated like they don't matter. And I'm not going to let this go, not without a fight." Calvin Drake paused for a moment and then looked directly into the camera. "I'm not just asking for answers. I'm asking for accountability. I'm asking for real change, and I'm asking for the people who did this to me to be held responsible. No one deserves to be treated this way. And if I can do anything to make sure it doesn't happen again, I will." He ended the video with a final quiet statement. "This isn't over." When the video went live, the response was immediate. People across the country, some who had supported him from the beginning and others who had only heard about the incident after the viral video, rallied behind him. His statement wasn't just about what had happened on that plane. It was a call to action, a call to not let these kinds of injustices continue unchecked. News outlets picked up the video, and it began to spread even further. Within hours, the airline had issued another statement, this time much stronger than the vague comment they had made earlier. They expressed regret for what had happened and promised to review the actions of the flight attendant and the police officers involved. But the damage had already been done. Public trust had already been shaken, and it was clear that a simple apology wouldn't be enough. The police department too had been forced to issue a response, promising an internal review of their officers' conduct. But as Calvin Drake's story gained more traction, it became clear that both the airline and the police were under intense pressure to show that they would not simply sweep this under the rug. The public wanted real consequences. They wanted change. And now, thanks to Calvin Drake's courage in speaking out, they were beginning to get it. This wasn't the end of the battle, but for Calvin Drake, speaking up had already felt like a victory. He had taken back control of his story, and in doing so, he had shown others who had experienced similar mistreatment that they didn't have to stay silent either. His journey had become about something far bigger than himself, and with each new supporter and each new voice joining the conversation, Calvin Drake knew that change was possible. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time since the incident, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. No matter what happened next, he knew one thing for sure: this was only the beginning. As Calvin Drake's video statement continued to circulate and gain support, the pressure on both the airline and the police department intensified. The call for justice grew louder, and it became clear that this would not be a situation resolved quietly or quickly. What had started as a personal experience of humiliation had transformed into a public cause, with people demanding accountability for what had happened aboard Flight 190. Now Calvin Drake was about to embark on a legal journey that would take him through a labyrinth of bureaucracy, legal strategies, and public scrutiny. Within days of releasing his video, Calvin Drake had retained a legal team that specialized in civil rights cases. They had reached out to him after seeing the media coverage of the incident, offering their help and promising to hold the responsible parties accountable. They knew this case would be no easy fight, but they also understood its potential to shed light on broader issues of race, authority, and the treatment of veterans. Calvin Drake's lawyer, Megan Brooks, was a seasoned civil rights attorney who had represented clients in high-profitable cases before. She had been following the story closely and immediately recognized the significance of Calvin Drake's case. "This is more than just a case about an unjust removal from a flight," Megan Brooks said during their first meeting. "This is about ensuring that no one, regardless of their race or status, is treated like that in public. This is about holding institutions accountable for the actions of their employees and officers, and it's about setting a precedent that says enough is enough." Calvin Drake knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The legal process would take time, and he was well aware of the emotional toll it would continue to take on him. But now he was no longer fighting just for himself. The more he thought about it, the more he realized this was about something much bigger, something that could have lasting repercussions for how veterans, particularly Black veterans, were treated in situations involving authority. As the legal team began to gather evidence, things started moving quickly. They requested footage from the airline security cameras, interviewed passengers who had been on the flight, and filed a formal complaint with the police department, demanding a full investigation into the officers' conduct. The goal was not just to seek damages for Calvin Drake's emotional distress and public humiliation, but also to push for a formal review of both the airlines and the police department's policies regarding such incidents. If they could prove that Calvin Drake's treatment had violated his civil rights, they would have a strong case for a lawsuit. Meanwhile, the airline, sensing the growing momentum of the public outcry, announced that they were working on a comprehensive internal review. However, as they continued to avoid making any real public commitment to specific actions, the anger only deepened. Activists, legal experts, and the general public all agreed that the airline needed to do more than just issue statements. They needed to take tangible steps toward accountability, especially since their flight attendants had failed to de-escalate the situation. The police department, too, was feeling the heat. The officers involved in Calvin Drake's removal had been placed on administrative leave pending the internal investigation, but this alone wasn't enough to satisfy the public. The idea that the police were simply looking into the situation wasn't enough for those who had seen the footage and heard Calvin Drake's story. People demanded real consequences. At the heart of the legal battle was the question of whether Calvin Drake's civil rights had been violated, whether the officers were justified in forcibly removing him from the flight, whether the flight attendant Chloe Morgan had acted within the boundaries of her job or had unfairly escalated the situation, and, perhaps most importantly, whether the airline and the police had mishandled a relatively minor disagreement by choosing to treat Calvin Drake as a threat rather than resolving the issue peacefully. As Calvin Drake's legal team began to gather witness testimonies and more evidence, they discovered several unsettling details. Passengers who had initially been reluctant to speak up were now coming forward with their accounts. Many of them had been sitting near Calvin Drake and had heard the entire exchange between him and the flight attendant. They testified that Calvin Drake had never raised his voice or made any threats. Several passengers even described how the flight attendant had been condescending and dismissive from the very beginning, which had contributed to the escalation. One witness, a woman named Karen, who had been sitting 2 rows behind Calvin Drake, recalled the moments before the officers arrived. It was clear that Calvin was trying to explain himself. He wasn't arguing, he was just asking questions, Karen said in her statement. But the flight attendant wouldn't listen, and when the officers came, it just got worse. They didn't even try to talk to him. They just started pulling him out of his seat. I've never seen anything like it. This testimony would become crucial in building Calvin Drake's case. The legal team believed that if they could prove the flight attendant's actions had been disproportionate and that the officers had overstepped their authority, they could make a strong case for an unlawful removal as well as emotional and psychological damages. In addition to the testimonies, Calvin Drake's legal team also filed Freedom of Information Act (FOIA) requests to obtain any police records or communications between the officers and the airline that might shed light on the situation. They were determined to leave no stone unturned. The more evidence they could gather, the stronger their case would be. They also knew this could take months or even years to fully resolve. The wheels of justice often moved slowly. But Calvin Drake was now in it for the long haul. Meanwhile, the public continued to rally behind Calvin Drake. The Justice for Calvin Drake movement gained more traction, and more prominent figures began to speak out. Several well-known civil rights organizations issued statements of support, and groups of veterans started organizing marches and rallies. They wore T-shirts with Calvin Drake's face on them and carried signs that read, "Veterans deserve respect, and no one should be treated like this." The movement was growing stronger by the day, and Calvin Drake began to realize that his fight wasn't just about getting justice for himself. It was about something much bigger. As the days passed, Calvin Drake couldn't help but feel a mixture of exhaustion and determination. He had been through so much in such a short amount of time, and yet he had come out the other side with a sense of purpose. The legal battle would be long and difficult, but he wasn't backing down. This fight wasn't just about his dignity. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to endure the same treatment he had. And as his legal team continued to build their case, Calvin Drake understood that this was far from over. The pressure was mounting. The eyes of the nation were watching, and he was ready to continue the fight, no matter how long it took. As the legal battle grew in intensity, so did the media coverage. What had started as a viral video of Calvin Drake being dragged off the plane had morphed into a national story. The incident, once just a private, isolated event, was now a symbol of deeper societal issues: racial inequality, mistreatment of veterans, and the unchecked power of airline and police authorities. With each passing day, the pressure on both the airline and the police department mounted, and the world was watching closely to see how they would respond. The media's attention on Calvin Drake was relentless. Major news outlets, cable networks, and talk shows all jumped on the story, each trying to dissect the incident and give it meaning beyond the obvious spectacle. It wasn't just about the viral footage anymore. It was about why it had happened, how it had escalated so quickly, and what it revealed about the state of public interactions with authority. At first, the interviews with Calvin Drake were few and far between. He wasn't ready to speak publicly in the immediate aftermath of the incident. He was still processing what had happened and figuring out the best way to move forward. But as the weeks passed and the story gained more traction, Calvin Drake realized that staying silent wasn't an option. He had already made his statement, but now it was time to tell his side of the story in more detail. It was time to speak directly to the people who had supported him, to give them more than just a brief video response. The first major TV interview Calvin Drake agreed to do was with a prominent news anchor on a primetime show. It was a pivotal moment, not just for his case, but for the broader conversation about police overreach and the treatment of Black veterans. The producers promised him a platform to share his truth, and Calvin Drake was determined to make the most of it. The day of the interview, Calvin Drake walked into the studio, his nerves barely hidden beneath his calm exterior. It was one of the first times he had been in front of cameras since the incident, and the weight of the situation was not lost on him. He knew this interview would reach millions of viewers, some of whom might already have preconceived notions about him or about the case. But he also knew that this was an opportunity to tell the world what had really happened, to show the humanity behind the headlines. When the interview began, the anchor, a well-known journalist named Olivia Clark, introduced Calvin Drake and immediately asked the question everyone wanted to know. "Calvin Drake, what went through your mind when the police arrived and started to forcibly remove you from the plane?" His answer was slow at first as he carefully chose his words. "I honestly couldn't believe what was happening," he began. "I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten anyone. I was just trying to ask why the flight attendant wasn't listening to me. And then, within minutes, I was being treated like a criminal. It felt like I didn't even have a chance to explain myself before they started pulling me off that plane." Olivia Clark nodded, acknowledging the gravity of his words. She pressed further. "But Calvin Drake, this incident, it's not just about what happened in those moments, is it? There's a larger conversation happening now about racial profiling, about the treatment of Black veterans. Do you think this incident is part of something much bigger?" Calvin Drake paused, his gaze turning more serious. "Absolutely," he said firmly. "What happened to me is something that happens to too many people every day. But it happens more to Black people, and it happens to veterans. There's this assumption that we don't deserve the same respect, and when we try to stand up for ourselves, we're treated like we're the problem. I didn't just feel humiliated, I felt like I was being punished for something I did." The interview continued with Olivia Clark asking more questions about Calvin Drake's military background and how his experience in the Army shaped the way he viewed authority and conflict. Calvin Drake spoke with honesty, sharing that he had spent years serving his country, yet had never been treated with the same dignity and respect as a civilian. He talked about the emotional toll the incident had taken on him, his struggle to come to terms with the public nature of his humiliation, and the way it had affected his sense of self-worth. The more Calvin Drake spoke, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about a disagreement over a bag or a misunderstanding with a flight attendant. It was about systemic issues. It was about the power dynamics that existed between the public and those in authority, and how quickly situations could escalate when one person, especially someone from a marginalized community, is treated with disrespect. Calvin Drake wasn't just advocating for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been dismissed or dehumanized simply because of their race or their status. The interview ended with a powerful statement from Calvin Drake. "This is bigger than just me. I've heard from so many people who've been through similar situations, and I'm fighting for them too. No one should have to experience what I went through. This needs to change." The interview had the desired effect. The outpouring of support for Calvin Drake was immediate and widespread. His words resonated with so many people who had felt powerless in similar situations, who had been unfairly treated by authorities or institutions, and the hashtag Justice for Calvin Drake exploded across social media. And people from all walks of life shared their own stories of being mistreated or misjudged. The media coverage didn't stop there. News outlets around the country followed up with in-depth analysis of the case. Legal experts weighed in, questioning the actions of the flight attendant and the police officers, and activists spoke about the broader context of racial injustice, especially in interactions between Black civilians and law enforcement. But not all the media coverage was supportive. Some outlets, particularly those with a more conservative audience, questioned whether Calvin Drake had overreacted. They speculated about his behavior and the supposed threat he posed to the flight attendants and police officers. These narratives quickly became part of the backlash, with some detractors attempting to paint Calvin Drake as someone who had caused the situation himself. However, Calvin Drake didn't let the negativity derail him. He knew the importance of his story, and he knew that the road to justice wasn't going to be easy for every person who stood up in his support. There were others who tried to dismiss the significance of what had happened, but Calvin Drake was now resolute. He had seen the impact of his story, felt the weight of the movement that was forming behind him, and knew that this wasn't just about his personal vindication. It was about setting a precedent for how people, especially veterans and people of color, should be treated by those in positions of authority. The media frenzy, with all its highs and lows, continued to shape the trajectory of Calvin Drake's case. It put the spotlight on the broader issues of police and airline misconduct, but it also forced him to continue to reflect on the personal cost of speaking out. With every interview, every appearance, he had to navigate a delicate balance between telling his truth and managing the emotional weight of reliving the trauma. But in the end, Calvin Drake understood that the more people heard his story, the more chance there was for real change to happen. And as long as the media kept the conversation alive, he would continue to fight for himself, for other veterans, and for anyone who had ever been silenced or mistreated. As Calvin Drake continued his fight, the emotional toll of the legal battle, the media scrutiny, and the constant pressure began to weigh heavily on him. What had started as a simple act of speaking out had transformed into something far more demanding and exhausting. The phone calls, the interviews, the constant social media notifications, it was all a blur, an endless cycle of attention that didn't allow him a moment to breathe. At first, Calvin Drake had been determined. He was ready to take on whatever came his way, to be the voice for those who had been wronged, to demand accountability for what had happened on that plane. But as the weeks turned into months, the reality of the situation started to sink in. The fight for justice was long, grueling, and at times lonely. He had spent hours upon hours working with his legal team, poring over documents, reading testimonies, and preparing for court appearances. He had spent countless days reliving the traumatic moments on the plane. Each time he revisited those memories, it felt like the humiliation, the helplessness, and the anger surged up again. It was as if he was being dragged down that narrow aisle once more, a helpless spectator in his own story. The media attention, too, was starting to feel suffocating. While he had once welcomed the platform to speak his truth, it had become harder to ignore the public's varying opinions. There were those who rallied behind him, who supported his every word and every step, but there were also others who dismissed his experience, blaming him for the escalation or accusing him of seeking attention. His own social media accounts were flooded with messages from strangers, some supportive, others harshly critical. It felt as though every move he made was being scrutinized and every word he spoke was dissected. He began to feel the weight of the judgment, the constant need to explain himself, to prove that he wasn't the aggressor, to justify his right to exist with dignity. The fight had shifted from seeking justice to surviving the barrage of opinions that came from every corner of the world. The emotional fatigue was more than he had ever anticipated. And then there was the constant questioning. Is this all worth it? Every day he woke up with a sense of purpose, but as the months wore on, the energy that had once fueled him began to drain away. It wasn't just the pain of the incident itself anymore. It was the exhaustion of carrying this fight on his shoulders alone. The more he pressed forward, the more isolated he felt. His friends and family supported him, but they didn't truly understand the emotional toll it took. And while the movement for justice had grown, it wasn't always easy to reconcile the overwhelming support with the quiet moments when he felt like giving up. One evening, after a particularly grueling day in court, Calvin Drake sat alone in his apartment, the weight of it all pressing down on him. He looked out the window, his mind racing. It had been a long time since he'd allowed himself to truly feel what had happened. He had been so focused on the next step, on the next interview, on the next court date, that he hadn't given himself the time to process the trauma. He hadn't given himself the space to just be that night. The tears came. They came not just from the pain of that fateful flight, but from everything that had followed. The relentless media cycle, the legal pressure, the constant reminders of an injustice that he could never fully escape. For the first time, Calvin Drake allowed himself to feel what he had been bottling up for months. He had been so focused on fighting on being strong, on representing something bigger than himself, that he had neglected his own mental and emotional well-being. But in the quiet of his apartment, as he wiped away the tears, Calvin Drake realized something important. This moment, this breaking point, wasn't the end. It was a pivotal moment of healing. Sometimes, in the pursuit of justice, you had to acknowledge the pain before you could move forward. Sometimes, you had to fall apart before you could rebuild yourself. The next day, Calvin Drake took a step back. He took a brief respite from the legal proceedings and the media blitz. He needed time to breathe, to focus on his own recovery. He didn't stop fighting. He just gave himself a chance to recover before he jumped back into the battle. He began spending more time with his family and friends, seeking the support he had been too busy to receive before. He also reached out to a therapist, realizing that in order to continue the fight for justice, he needed to heal himself first. As he began to take better care of his mental health, something began to shift in him. The anger that had fueled him for so long was still there, but it wasn't as consuming. He started to regain his strength, his sense of purpose, and his ability to move forward with clarity. He realized that this fight wasn't just about the destination, it was about the journey. And that meant taking care of himself along the way. The process wasn't quick, and the emotional scars wouldn't disappear overnight. But Calvin Drake understood now that in order to stand strong for the causes he believed in, he had to be whole himself. He had to be at peace with his own experience before he could demand peace for others. Calvin Drake returned to the fight with renewed determination. He wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. He was fighting for healing, not just for himself, but for others who had been through similar struggles. He knew that the fight ahead would continue to be difficult, but now he felt better equipped to handle the emotional roller coaster that came with it. He had learned an important lesson during his time of reflection. Justice wasn't just about winning a case or changing policies. It was about healing, understanding, and giving people the space to be whole again. With a newfound strength, Calvin Drake was ready to continue that fight, no matter how long it took. Months had passed since Calvin Drake had publicly shared his side of the story. And while the pressure had never fully subsided, something had shifted in the way people were responding. The media coverage, initially a chaotic frenzy of sensationalism, began to evolve into a more thoughtful, nuanced conversation about justice, race, and power. The public's anger, which had been raw and immediate, began to give way to a deeper understanding of the issues at hand. The more Calvin Drake spoke out, the more others who had been in similar situations found their voices as well. The first sign of this shift came when several high-profile civil rights organizations began to step in. Groups like the NAACP, the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, and various veterans organizations rallied behind Calvin Drake, offering not just support but resources to further amplify his fight. They recognized that this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger systemic issue that needed addressing. They joined his legal team in filing additional motions, pushing for an investigation into broader patterns of discrimination against Black veterans, especially in situations involving law enforcement and authority figures. Calvin Drake had been relentless in his pursuit of justice, but with the support of these powerful organizations, the weight of his case was no longer solely on his shoulders. His team of lawyers, bolstered by civil rights experts, expanded the scope of the legal battle. They now focused not just on the actions of the flight attendants and the police officers on Flight 190, but also on the policies and practices that allowed such incidents to happen in the first place. They began investigating other similar cases, looking for patterns of racial profiling, police overreach, and mistreatment of veterans, particularly veterans of color. They found disturbing evidence that Calvin Drake's case wasn't as unique as it seemed. Meanwhile, Calvin Drake's mental health continued to improve. The break he had taken earlier in the year, when he stepped back from the media spotlight, had given him the time he needed to heal. He was spending more time with his family, reconnecting with his community, and even speaking to others who had experienced similar injustices. He spoke at rallies, attended veteran events, and shared his story with others who had faced wrongful treatment. The process of sharing his pain and of hearing others tell their own stories became part of his healing journey. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about a collective struggle for justice. Every time someone else came forward, Calvin Drake felt a little less alone. Despite the emotional weight, the public support for Calvin Drake began to intensify. His case was no longer just about the rights of a single individual. It had become a symbol of the broader fight against racial injustice. On social media, activists and everyday people rallied around him, using his story as a springboard to launch larger conversations about the disproportionate treatment of Black men and women in everyday situations. His journey was covered in documentaries, articles, and podcasts, all trying to highlight not just the incident on the plane, but the larger societal issues it represented. Public opinion on Calvin Drake's case continued to evolve as well. What was once a divisive issue, with many questioning Calvin Drake's actions or blaming him for the escalation, had transformed into a widespread call for reform. A growing coalition of politicians, activists, and ordinary citizens now stood behind him, demanding changes in police training, airline policies, and the way people of color were treated in public spaces. It was clear that the system, as it wasn't working for everyone. And Calvin Drake's story had illuminated the cracks in it. The pressure was now on the airline, which had been avoiding taking real responsibility for its role in the incident. After months of public outcry, the airline finally agreed to meet with Calvin Drake's legal team. The negotiations were intense, with both sides trying to come to terms. But the airline, now facing not just legal repercussions but the wrath of public opinion, agreed to a settlement. The details of the settlement were kept private, but it was clear that Calvin Drake had won. The airline not only agreed to pay damages, but also promised to review and overhaul its training for flight attendants, with a specific focus on de-escalation and racial sensitivity. The police department, too, had been feeling the pressure. While the officers involved in Calvin Drake's removal had not been formally disciplined, the public outcry, combined with pressure from civil rights groups and political leaders, forced the department to implement new policies aimed at preventing similar incidents in the future. The officers involved were required to undergo additional training in community policing and racial sensitivity. The department also announced a broader review of how its officers handled public disturbances, particularly in situations involving veterans and people of color. While many saw this as a step in the right direction, others believed it was just the beginning. Real change would only come when the entire system, from law enforcement to the airlines, began to shift its mindset about how it treated marginalized communities. For Calvin Drake, the settlement and the policy changes were victories, but they weren't the end of the battle. He knew that real change couldn't be achieved with just a few policy tweaks. He knew the conversation had to continue, that the momentum had to be kept alive. He began working with civil rights groups and veterans organizations to push for nationwide reforms in how veterans were treated by law enforcement and public institutions. He spoke at town halls, testified before committees, and worked tirelessly to make sure that no one would ever have to go through what he had experienced. One of the most significant moments came when Calvin Drake was invited to speak before Congress. The hearing was centered around police reform, racial justice, and how institutions could better serve and respect veterans of color. Calvin Drake, who had once been reluctant to speak publicly, now stood at the forefront of a movement, his voice strong and steady. "I didn't want to be here," he began. "I didn't want to tell my story to the world, but I had no choice. When the system fails, when the people we trust to protect us turn against us, we have to stand up. We have to demand change. And if my story can help others, then I'll keep telling it, no matter how painful it is." The applause that followed was deafening. It wasn't just a victory for Calvin Drake. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been mistreated by the system, for everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of authority. Calvin Drake had turned his pain into power, his suffering into strength, and his voice had become a catalyst for change. As the months passed and the momentum of his movement continued to grow, Calvin Drake knew that the fight wasn't over. There were still battles to be fought, and there were still people who needed to be heard. But in that moment, standing before Congress, Calvin Drake realized that he had done more than just seek justice for himself. He had sparked a conversation that was bigger than any one individual, a conversation that would continue to shape the future of racial justice, veterans' rights, and how people are treated when they step onto a plane or into any public space. The turning tide had begun, and it was only the beginning of the change that Calvin Drake Steele and countless others had fought for, as Calvin Drake stood at the forefront of the movement he had inadvertently sparked. He couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. What had started as a personal ordeal, an embarrassing and humiliating event on a flight, had transformed into a national conversation about justice, race, and treatment. The journey had been long, painful, and full of challenges, but now, looking back, he recognized his progress. Calvin Drake felt a deep sense of accomplishment, not for the victories in the courtroom, the media attention, or even the settlement from the airline, but for something much bigger. He had started this fight for himself, to right the wrongs that had been done to him. However, somewhere along the way, he realized it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who had ever been mistreated by authority, every black veteran who had felt overlooked, and every individual who had been silenced because of their race, gender, or background. Calvin Drake had found his voice, and in doing so, he had given others the courage to find theirs too. The months that followed Congress's hearing were filled with ongoing discussions about systemic reform. Legislation aimed at improving the treatment of veterans of color, as well as broader police reform, began to gain traction. He worked closely with lawmakers, veterans organizations, and civil rights groups, all united in a common goal to ensure that what happened to him on Flight 190 would never happen again. It wasn't just about policy change, it was about a shift in public consciousness. People were starting to understand that the issues Calvin Drake had faced were not isolated incidents, but part of a pattern of unfair treatment that affected many across the country. The more he spoke, the more stories came forward from others who had been mistreated, and the more the public began to see how deep the problem ran. The airline industry began to adopt new, more inclusive training programs for staff, focusing not only on safety and efficiency, but also on respecting passengers' rights and dignity. Law enforcement agencies across the country started reevaluating their policies on handling disruptions in public spaces, recognizing the need for more de-escalation tactics and a better understanding of racial dynamics. The fight, Calvin Drake knew, was far from over. It would take years, even decades, before the changes needed to build a more just and equitable society would fully take root. But for the first time, he felt that the tide was turning. He wasn't alone in this fight anymore, and the voices calling for change were louder than ever. Amidst all the changes and victories, he remained grounded in his purpose. He had never set out to become a public figure or an advocate. He was just a man who had been wronged and wanted justice. Yet in the end, his story had become a catalyst for something much larger than he had ever imagined. As the years passed, Calvin Drake continued to speak out, not just on behalf of himself, but for the countless others who still felt invisible or unheard. In the years following his battle, he returned to his roots. He began mentoring younger veterans, particularly those from marginalized communities, teaching them not only how to navigate the complexities of civilian life after service, but also how to advocate for themselves and stand up against injustice when they encountered it. He also worked closely with organizations that provided legal assistance to veterans and underprivileged communities, helping to ensure that no one else would have to go through what he did without support. In time, Calvin Drake found a sense of peace that had eluded him during the most difficult parts of his journey. He was no longer burdened by the trauma of that flight, and although the emotional scars remained, they were no longer what defined him. His identity as a veteran, a father, a brother, and a community leader had grown stronger. He had become a symbol of resilience, someone who had turned his pain into purpose. One evening, as he sat at home reflecting on all that had happened, he received a letter from a young veteran who had heard about his story. In the letter, the veteran wrote about how he had been mistreated at a public event, how he had felt powerless and alone, but after hearing Calvin Drake's story, he found the strength to speak up. "I never thought I could be heard," the letter said, but because of you, I know I can be." Calvin Drake read the letter and, for the first time in a long while, allowed himself to feel the weight of everything he had fought for. It wasn't just about changing policy or making headlines. It was about changing lives. He had given someone else the courage to stand up. In that moment, he knew that the legacy of his fight had become something far more meaningful than he had ever expected. He had fought not just for justice in his own life, but for a world where people were not judged by the color of their skin or the uniform they wore, but by the content of their character. And though the battle was far from over, Calvin Drake had become part of a greater movement, one that, piece by piece, was changing the world for the better. The journey, he knew, would never truly end. But for now he was content in knowing that his struggle had made a difference, not just for him, but for countless others who had faced similar challenges. The legacy of his fight for justice had created ripples that would continue to spread for generations to come. The lesson from this story is about the importance of protecting one's dignity and relentlessly fighting for justice, even when you're facing injustice and racial prejudice. Calvin Drake's story, a Black veteran, clearly shows how a simple misunderstanding on a flight can quickly escalate into a tragedy when people fail to listen and show mutual respect. This incident underscores that the right to be treated fairly isn't just an individual matter. It's a responsibility shared by our communities and law enforcement to create a humane environment for everyone. Despite enduring oppression and violence from both airline staff and police officers, Calvin Drake didn't stay silent. Instead, he chose to speak out, inspiring others who have faced similar challenges. This teaches us that courage and persistence in standing up for what is right are key to overcoming injustice. Moreover, the story reminds us of the need to improve training processes, boost awareness about diversity, and promote respect for human rights. By doing so, we can build a society that is fairer and more compassionate, where every person is heard and treated with the dignity they deserve. Thank you so much for joining us today. If this story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up, leave your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more engaging content that will inspire and entertain you. Your feedback not only motivates us to create more unforgettable tales, but also helps us build a vibrant community of story lovers. We look forward to sharing even more exciting and thought-provoking stories with you in the future.